So I think you can see where this is going. I think maybe an alternative title for this panel might have been, where should we locate the violence of interwar France? Like, where is it located? We have a French imperial nation state which is training its colonial officers in a certain way, and their experience is shaping the violence in the political sphere. And we also famously understand the Third Republic as a place that has constructed a certain vision of the family, a certain vision of the state's relationship to the family. And they're, yeah, I know, but I'm gonna introduce him and then I'm gonna stand up. So,
I think you should even introduce.
Okay, I'll stand up here. All right, so I just want to say that Chris's paper, which I will now read to you, is going to, in some ways, tie this together. How is the violence of the street, which was becoming ordinary in the 1930s, experienced by the policemen themselves during the Third Republic? So I'm now assuming the voice of Chris Millington. Let me briefly introduce Chris. Chris is an associate professor of history at Swansea University in the UK, and it is this distance, in fact, which made it impossible for him to come, and we are terribly sorry that he couldn't be here. He sent his paper, which is a summary of an argument in a portion of a book which will be appearing this April from Oxford University Press, entitled Fighting for France, Violence in Interwar French Politics. I'm going to read this paper, but let me just note that the paper was a little long in the version that was sent to me, and I was forced to do some editing to come in within time. I eliminated some of the examples, and you'll see where I'm skipping. There's a little bit of a break, but I think you'll understand the argument. The title of the talk is Brutes and Bludgeoners, Policing Interwar France. Chris Millington, Swansea University, UK. On the evening of March 28th, 1926, a crowd of several thousand people gathered on the Place de l'Opéra in Paris. They were awaiting the results of a by-election runoff between communist Jacques Duclos and conservative Paul Reynaud. At 10:45 p.m., the electronic board mounted on the building of the Echo de Paris newspaper building announced Reynaud's defeat. The news was greeted with anger and dismay. Several hundred men, amongst whom police noted numerous members of the extreme right-wing leagues, began to march toward the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Their target was the Ministry of the Interior and Louis Malvy, a hate figure for the right. The demonstration was preceded by a woman holding aloft a tricolor flag. Marchers clashed with police as they neared the presidential palace. Pushed back but undeterred, the Leaguers rallied behind the tricolor and readied their canes for a second charge. At this moment, a scuffle between officers and demonstrators saw the flagpole snapped in two. Located somewhere in the midst of the chaos was 22-year-old Maurice Ridard. Ridard lived in a small apartment in the Rue Berzelius with his younger brother Adrien, his sister Germaine, and his widowed mother. He was a student of mathematics at the Lycée Saint-Louis, and in March 1926, he was preparing for the entrance exam to the Saint-Cyr Military Academy. He was also a member of the Jeunesse Patriote, the right-wing paramilitary league. On the night of the election result, Maurice and Adrien had joined the demonstration. Adrien lost sight of his brother for a short time after fighting at a police barricade. They were reunited thereafter, but Maurice seemed disoriented. He pointed to his face and uttered what were to be his final words. "Oh, the brutes, they've hit me." As Adrien and his comrades helped Maurice into a taxi, the young men told the driver it was the cops who thrashed him. Maurice Ridard died at home later that evening, having suffered a brain hemorrhage caused by several violent blows to the face. According to the Jeunesse Patriote, Maurice had been murdered at the hands of the communist-controlled police, a convention seemingly reinforced by Adrien's claim that he had seen his brother struck down while defending the tricolore. The Jeunesse Patriote leader, Pierre Taittinger, lamented the death of Maurice and commemorated him by describing it. His skull split by truncheon blows, beaten, stamped upon, he collapsed just steps from the flag that he was sheltering with his body in the atrocious melee. His blood streamed across the cobblestones of this town that he had sworn to defend. Maurice Ridard died on the field of honor. So it is incidents like this that Chris focuses on in his book on violence and politics and interwar. I'm not going to assume the personal pronoun here. He examines narratives constructed around violent incidents in order to reveal the frameworks through which violence was interpreted and represented, ultimately seeking to answer the question, does democracy eliminate political violence? Do we need to ask this question now? Sorry. The book challenges the dominant thesis on political confrontation in interwar France. This thesis, formulated in 1983 by Serge Berstein, claims that conflict between political groups was confined to rhetorical bluster in the press and cathartic posturing in the street. Unlike in Germany and Italy, the French, so this argument goes, preferred shadowboxing, a fact that underscored their deep commitment to democracy. There may have been a few intransigent men on the margins of politics who preferred fighting to voting, yet even they could not resist the pull of the democratic consensus. According to Berstein, the confrontation of the 1920s and the 1930s was therefore simulated. Berstein's thesis rests less on empirical evidence and more on a desire to prove French exceptionalism. Yet Chris's desire is not to paint an equally dubious picture in which interwar France was as violent as Germany, for example. It wasn't. His concern is to examine the violence that occurred and how political groups in the police understood it. There was no essential meaning to this violence and no single recipe according to which fighting broke out. In very similar circumstances, activists could attack each other with extreme violence or refrain from striking a blow. Immediate contextual considerations determined the deployment of violence. Likewise, the consequences of violence were unpredictable. When a revolver shot was fired, it could fly over the head of an opponent as much as it could find its mark, with lethal consequences. Accounts of violence employed understandings of manly behavior, according to which violence was acceptable when perpetrated in a particular context and in a particular way. The standards against which violent acts were measured were shared across the political spectrum. When framed as defensive, violence could be deployed legitimately and rationally, even within the context of a democratic political culture. So the focus of this paper is the violence meted out by policemen to political activists, and often to innocent bystanders. Allegations of police brutality were all too familiar to the French public. The brutish behavior of officers was a matter of concern for Republicans who themselves had often suffered the infamous passage à tabac, or thrashing in the police stations of the Second Empire. Republican policing manuals therefore emphasized the recently acquired democratic rights of citizens and the conduct expected of officers. Political reality undermined Republican hopes of pacifying the security forces. The vulnerability of the new democratic regime in the 1870s and 1880s rendered a wholesale purge of the police force impractical. Continuity in personnel was paralleled by a continuity in practice and police behavior that was determined more by habits learned in the everyday fulfillment of duties rather than in the classroom. Police were asked to, quote, jostle people with a smile, but they continued to make use of their fists, their hobnailed boots, their cape, which could be rolled into a makeshift coche, and their saber bayonets. In the privacy of the police stations, arrestees were routinely pummeled. Police thus earned the nickname cogne, a word derived from the verb cogner, meaning to hit or to beat. The law did permit officers to use force in certain circumstances. If a disorderly crowd refused to disperse, an officer of the civilian authority, usually the mayor or the prefect, was required to read aloud the sommation, the warnings. The sommation followed the formula written into law on the 3rd of August, 1791. Obey the law, we are going to use force, good citizens should withdraw. However, in the tumult of a riot, it was difficult to determine not only whether the sommation had been read, but also whether they had been heard over the noise of the crowd. Police training manuals discouraged the use of offensive physical force. In 1908, Parisian police superintendent Charles Péchard produced a guide to practical jiu-jitsu for officers. Péchard intended to provide readers with both the means and the self-confidence with which to bring a disorderly character under control. In doing so, he stressed that a non-violent approach was vital. Moral force and sang-froid, qualities deemed masculine in the culture of the time, could be a match even for those of superior strength. An officer should act with firmness, self-control, and reasoned action rather than instinct. His weapon was a symbol of his authority rather than a tool to be employed. Author Jean-Joseph Renaud also recommended that police officers consult his 1912 Guide to Self-Defense, arguing that the holds learned in jiu-jitsu could be used in darkness. When to throw a punch would more likely miss the target. After 1918, Parisian constables did take classes in jiu-jitsu where they learned not only how to render an attacker harmless, sentence problem here, in nonviolent fashion. But the authorities recognized that officers would need to use force to make arrests. Their jiu-jitsu classes therefore taught trainees how to smash a limb, how to dislocate an elbow, or a knee quick as a flash. Furthermore, officers could not be prosecuted if death, wounds, or blows were inflicted in defensive violence. The meaning of self-defense was, however, ambiguous. Renaud's self-defense manual recommended that while prudence was necessary, it's better to kill the devil than to be killed by him. This ambiguous understanding of self-defense, which implied that preemptive violence was justified, was common among political groups too. The emphasis on masculine action and values meant that physically and culturally, interwar policing was a man's profession. Women employed in policing were restricted to support roles. In 1914, the Prefecture of Police employed 12 women as typists. The few women who entered the public space as officers were charged with duties thought to be consonant with their assumed feminine qualities. In 1935, for example, 2 female assistantes were made responsible for the safety of small children on Parisian railways. More frequently, women figured in press reports as the victims of police violence, a fact that served to emphasize the brutality of officers in the partisan press. Doubtless many reports were exaggerated. In fact, there was evidence that photographs of police violence in the press could be faked, whether staged by actors or doctored to show the police using weapons. Despite efforts to control police behavior, exchanges between officers and political activists were difficult to regulate. When public gatherings larger than 15 people, with public gatherings larger than 15 people illegal, constables were called upon frequently to disperse such groups. In most cases, a shout of "Circulez" was sufficient to break up a congregation on the pavement or the roadway. For people who refused to obey this order, a thump or kick could change their mind. Constables could also employ their famed baton. This baton was 44 centimeters in length, made of beechwood covered in white celluloid. It was replaced in 1937 by a rubber-covered baton, which, according to historian Christian-Henri Tavard, was designed to be softer on the backs of the demonstrators. So I'm going to skip some of the other examples that Chris gives, and I'm going to give his account of the violence at Clichy in March 1937, which will give us an idea of the task that faced officers when confronted with an angry mob. At Clichy, clashes between anti-fascists and police saw 5 demonstrators and 1 constable killed. Police found it difficult to push the anti-fascist crowd back from its objective, a right-wing political meeting in a local cinema. From 6 p.m., people from Clichy and the surrounding suburbs swelled the number of demonstrators, putting repeated pressure on the police barricade. By 8:30 p.m., an estimated 9,000 demonstrators were gathered in front of the town hall. A violent push put the police line under intense pressure. According to the memoirs of André Chéras, who commanded a riot squadron in the night, his men were nose to nose with demonstrators, wrestling with hardened communist fighters as they struggled to keep hold of their rifles. Chéras wrote, "The guard feels suffocated. The person opposite him is now so close that he can smell his breath, an odor of wine and tobacco. The unshaven chin scratches his nose. Then suddenly fists are in his face. Something very hard has pierced his skin, scraped on his teeth. Pain carries him into a bitter universe where the overwhelming sickliness of blood running down his neck awaits him. The man in the cap barks, 'Take that, you bastard.' Officers were struck with paving stones, pieces of street furniture. Boiling water was thrown at them from the windows of nearby buildings, even from the windows of the town hall itself. I'm going to skip over some more of this description. From 9:30 p.m., 20 vehicles carrying 238 gardiens from across the capital descended on Clichy. The vehicles became bogged down in the crowd, and their open-sided vans provided little protection as projectiles rained down on the reinforcements. 85 policemen were hurt as they disembarked their vehicles. Those who managed to exit the vans were soon separated from their colleagues, giving officers the impression that they were heavily outnumbered against the mob. At 9:45 p.m., panicked officers opened fire. Such was their terror that some fired through the sides of their vehicles from the interior. At this point, the order was given for the mounted police to clear the square. The majority of the crowd fled, but some protesters attacked with iron bars and razor blades. 96 riot officers were injured by projectiles, 4 suffered gunshot wounds. 157 officers in all suffered injuries. Constable Meunier was severely beaten and died from his injuries. So what does this examination of police violence reveal? First, the Third Republic was prepared to use violence against citizens. Police may have been asked to refrain from such behavior with training in manly conduct, but their everyday encounters and experience on the job saw the rough treatment of the police persist. Violence committed in self-defense, loosely defined, was acceptable, tolerated by the police authorities, by politicians, and by courts. In turn, the officers themselves tended to tolerate low-level violence between political activists. The very banality of this violence raises questions as to whether the acceptance of small-scale violence in French political culture permitted the use of lethal violence from time to time. We cannot say that understandings of manliness or the desire to defend the Republic, this is the second point, or any other single reason explain outbreaks of violence. Police officers were often the target of intolerable provocation. As political tensions sharpened in the 1930s, the number of days that police devoted to the maintenance of order increased sharply. The Revue de la Gendarmerie recorded that in 1936, a riot officer spent 112 days on duties concerning the maintenance of order, nearly 5 times the total for such duties in 1932. In total, the forces of order devoted almost 4 times as many days to the maintenance of order in 1936 as in 1932. André Chéras claimed that by the 1937 riot, the police were exhausted after years of being moved from pillar to post in the name of maintaining order. Meanwhile, the Paris police constables had been worn down by the long period of political confrontation in France. Ultimately, in the heat of the moment, officers lashed out in anger, exasperation, or exhaustion, all of which were exacerbated by the mutual contempt evident between police and demonstrators. So that's Chris's talk. I'll tell him.